This is lecture 13A. I'm going to be talking about the Indian Ocean trade in this lecture, but before we do that, I want to just talk about India politically for just a little bit. We've brought these other parts of Eurasia up to the 1500s. We've talked about China with the Tang and Song dynasties. We've talked about the Abbasid Caliphate and those big empires. Now I want to bring India up to 1500. Now India has always sort of had its own history because it's hard to invade. It's got the Himalaya mountains all across its northeastern border. And along the northwestern border, you've got the Hindu Kush Mountains, and so India has always had its own path. But in any case, India has these periods of big empires that are interspersed with periods of small kingdoms, and we saw this before with the Mauryan Empire and the Gupta Empire, and they would coalesce for a while, or somebody would conquer a bunch of territory and create this larger empire, but then it would break up, and so India has this sort of long history of having these smaller kingdoms that carry on when there isn't a large empire. And often when you have a whole bunch of small kingdoms, you have a whole bunch of chaos. You have, think of the Warring States period in China or the Age of Divisions. But India tended to be less chaotic, and part of that was because of the caste system in Hinduism itself, which tended to prevent the kinds of social upheaval that might accompany political upheaval. And so, to a certain extent, the caste system in India tamped down on social discord. Now, beginning in the 600s, though, we do see the creation of a large kingdom or empire in northern India. It starts with a guy named King Harsha or Harshavardhana, who his family was his father was the king of a small kingdom in northern India, and the family's kind of interesting because there's some accounts that suggest that the father or some other ancestor might have been Vaishya in caste, which means the merchant caste, and that they had managed to become clerks or scribes or something in a royal court, and then had moved up and through politics managed to seize power. Other sources say they're Kshatriya, which is what you'd expect from a royal family, but there are these sources that suggest he might have been Vaishya. In any case, in the early 600s, a group of small republics and kingdoms in northern India essentially got together, decided to unify, and they named Harsha as their king. So he becomes king in 606, and he would then go on to use that power base to conquer much of the rest of northern India. And he, in fact, even tried to conquer southern India, but he was stopped by losing a battle in 618. Which pretty much closed off southern India for him. He signed a treaty with the small kingdom, or the small empire, large kingdom down there that had stopped him. So King Harsha's kingdom is sort of confined to northern India, but it was really a very successful kingdom during his lifetime. I mean, he ruled for 40 years, and it was really very successful in the sense that it was wealthy, it was cosmopolitan. Foreign visitors were always really impressed with the court, etc. And one other aspect of Harsha that's kind of interesting is that it's not clear whether he was a Buddhist or Hindu. Foreign visitors, especially Buddhist ones, tend to say, "Oh yeah, he's a Buddhist. I talked to him, and he builds shrines, and he maintains monasteries, and he's a Buddhist." But then other people say, "No, he worships Shiva, and he's a Hindu." And so it's kind of up in the air. What was King Harsha? We don't know. What we do know is that in 647, when he dies, his kingdom basically, there's no clear successor, and his kingdom breaks up into all the constituent kingdoms that it had been before. And so it essentially just disintegrates after he's gone. So it was just this period of stability for 40 years. The South is a different story. In the South, there were really for 700 years, there's a real stability with two empires in succession. The first is the Chola kingdom, which emerges in the 850 and managed to unify most of southern India, and it would last until 1267. And then you have the Vijayanagar kingdom, which comes along just 7 years later. So it's just a brief period of chaos in there. And then the Vijayanagar kingdom gets established, and it would last until 1565. So that's really 700 and some years of stability in southern India, which really allowed for economic growth, et cetera. And we'll talk about trade and how this factored into Indian Ocean trade, et cetera, later. So the southern India has this real stability. Northern India does not. But, and I want to reiterate this, India tends to have an enormous stability because of the caste system in Hinduism, even if it does not have political unification. Okay, the final political piece, though, in India is a really disruptive one. In the 700s, the Abbasid, or the Umayyads, had Muslims from the Middle East, had conquered northwestern India, modern-day Pakistan, basically. And so that territory was Muslim from the 700s onwards. Because of that, beginning about the 1000s, you start to see Turkic raiders who are Muslim, who have converted to Islam, they're from Central Asia, and they basically migrated into the Muslim empire and often served as soldiers and things like that, but then they would go and become raiders on non-Muslim territories. We saw this with the Turks in Anatolia, well, the Turks who came into the Abbasid Caliphate, and when Anatolian were attacking the Byzantine Empire, and we saw that before. Now, with India, these raiders begin to appear in about 1000, and they start to come over from what we would call Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they come in, and they pass through the Muslim territories because they're Muslim, and they head into India, and they would carry out these massive raids. They would have 10,000 guys on horses, and they would just plow through villages and rape, pillage, loot, destroy, etc. And really, it was very hard often for these small kingdoms in northern India to stop them, because they couldn't put together, because they were so divided, they couldn't put together a huge army to confront the Turks, and the Turks had enough soldiers or raiders on horseback that they really are a very formidable military force. And so beginning in the 1000s, you began to see these Turks coming in to India and conquering and raping and pillaging and looting and destroying. And over time, these raids started to get longer and longer. Initially, they would just pop over, attack a city, pillage it for a week or two, and then come back. But then later, they start to do these longer raids where they go village after village, city after city after city. And eventually they start to just sort of hang around, and normally there's a season when you're going to do this stuff because of the weather. Well, they would just hang around for the off season too, and they wind up staying. And essentially, they gradually would begin to destabilize these small kingdoms and then essentially take over them. And what we finally see happen then is that in 1206, an actual Turkish government is formed called the Sultanate of Delhi. I just want to mention the Sultanate for a second here. I'm going to talk about this in later lectures this week. But the Turks were interesting because they had converted to Islam, and they were part of the Muslim world, and they fought for the Abbasids, and they were a real key part of the Muslim world. But for Arabs, they could not imagine a Turk could be the sort of religious leader of Islam, because Islam was seen as such an Arabic religion. And so whenever the Turks took power, and they took power in a lot of places, and I'll talk about this later, on the Ottoman Empire, etc., whenever the Turks took power, they did not try to present themselves as caliphs, as sort of religious and secular rulers. They took the title of Sultan, which was a strictly political military ruler title. So they were not trying to claim that they were sort of Muslim, the leaders of a Muslim community. They were simply claiming that they were military leaders and political leaders who happened to be Muslim, which is kind of an interesting distinction, which points to something kind of profound about Islam in the way that they thought of Islam as a religious community that had to be led by Arabs to be a true religious community. In any case, in the Sultanate of Delhi, what you get then and it lasts for 300 years, what you get in the Sultanate of Delhi is a Muslim minority, a Turkish Muslim minority ruling over a majority Indian Hindu population, such that the Sultanate of Delhi, you would think 300 years of Muslim rule, lots of people would have converted to Islam, and lots of people were converted to Islam at this time, but it wasn't because of this, because the Turks had all these raids for 200 years, had so soured people on Muslims in northern India. They were just like, Muslims are just a bunch of barbarians who come in and kill people. And so there really was a sort of a bitterness against Muslims there. And we'll see that lots of people in India did convert to Islam, but they did so through different routes, not through the Turks coming in and conquering the Sultanate of Delhi, which, I mean, it did create some conversions, but not nearly as many as you might expect. So this is the sort of military history. So the North had a brief unification under Harsha in the 600s, and then it had unification for 300 years from 1200 to 1526. The South was unified, however, from about 850 to 1565. So that's the political background. Now, in the next part of the lecture, I want to talk about trade in the Indian Ocean.